From the start of the inquiry, Covid Bereaved Families for Justice UK has sought to amplify the voices of the bereaved from across the four corners of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in order to ensure that lessons are learned and future lives are saved. It's impossible to properly learn lessons or change the future without a clear and deep understanding of lived experience of what has passed, and that, of course, is the importance of understanding impact, as you have clearly recognised in making this the subject of the final module. In his evidence to Module 1, Matt Fowler said that right from the get-go, he and Joanna Goodman, the co-founders of the group, felt that the important thing was change. We need to learn lessons. We need to learn about things that went wrong, and we need to put something in place to prevent those mistakes from being carried out again in the future. They did not know each other, but both lost their fathers, Ian and Stuart, at the start of April 2020, early in the pandemic, and incensed at what they saw as the absence of planning and an incompetent government, they joined up to campaign, along with 7,000 others, for the authorities to wake up and rapidly advance measures which would minimise the ongoing effects of the poor start to the pandemic response. In her statement for this module, Rivka Gottlieb vividly explains how she took up this mantle. There was no room for my grief, but I was very angry at the circumstances surrounding my father's death, and I swore that I would not rest until the government's mishandling of the early days of the pandemic had been exposed, examined, and those responsible held accountable. I was deeply concerned and distressed by what I saw as repeated failures as the pandemic continued with wave after wave. I felt as though I was watching a car crash in slow motion over and over again. The subsequent loss of life following the first wave felt devastating as nothing was being learned. Rivka went on to explain that she is haunted by the implications of COVID grief and by the knowledge that had lockdown been called 1 week earlier, my father's life and that of so many in subsequent waves may have been saved. The impact on Matt, Joe and Rivka was therefore not simply bereavement, but anger at the circumstances. This was not only a natural disaster, but one contributed to by human failure, which left them with what another bereaved family member was to describe as an open wound. Earlier lockdowns did, of course, occupy the attention of the inquiry in Module 2, but Rivka's evidence follows this through with the impact on her and many, many others of the knowledge of what might and should have been. Additionally, the bereavement of the families has been exacerbated by conspiracy theorists and COVID deniers. And in the last couple of years, there's been something of a backlash from some politicians and commentators and parts of the media arguing against lockdowns and other substantial deviations from normal life that were imposed during the heights of the pandemic. This politicisation of emergency interventions such as lockdowns, mask wearing and travel restrictions has again exacerbated the trauma of loss. The position of the families has always been unequivocal on this point. No one is an advocate for interfering with the normal freedoms of life. No one welcomes lockdowns. But a public emergency of the scale of COVID made such interventions necessary and crucial. The point isn't whether lockdowns were good or lockdowns were bad. The impact evidence from both the bereaved and others, without equivocation, emphasises that there were substantial negative effects on mental health, the provision of ordinary services for older people and those with particular needs, and family life and freedom of movement. But that emphasis only underlines the conclusions already reached by this inquiry, that if the UK had reacted more swiftly, if it had had preparedness and planning that was fit for purpose, then measures such as lockdowns and similar interventions would have been able to be shorter and more focused, as in certain other countries. Indeed, some lockdowns and similar interventions may have been avoided altogether. Not only would many lives have been saved by earlier decisive action, but the other negative impacts of those interventions would have been minimised too. So the evidence to be heard in Module 10 will elicit the impact not only of the pandemic itself, but of the failures of response that we've learned from earlier modules. It will also highlight factors resulting in disparities of outcome, as helpfully set out yesterday by Kate Blackwell, King's Counsel, and Ms. Rahman, King's Counsel today. To borrow from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, We may have been in the same storm, but we were not all in the same boat. Covid Bereaved Families for Justice UK is well placed to comment on disparities because its membership is not only spread across the whole of the UK, but it's very diverse indeed. It has bereaved family members from the many different ethnic communities across the country and people from a wide range of cultural and religious heritages and beliefs, people with clinical vulnerabilities, those themselves suffering from long COVID, people with physical disabilities, people with mental ill health. Some are young, some are older, men, women, people of different sexualities and various lifestyles, key workers of various types, professors, engineers, teachers, unpaid carers, the unemployed, people who are retired, the well-heeled and the economically challenged, all devastated by a disease which could and did affect us all, but not impacted in the same ways. In early modules, this inquiry has already heard evidence that some disparities of outcome occurred by chance or from the characteristics of the virus itself. But many were the consequences of structural and institutional discrimination of various kinds or occurred because of existing inequalities. The statistics noted by Ms. Blackwell did not occur by mere probability. This module will hear both individual accounts of impact, but also expert evidence regarding inequality and discrimination. We hope it will underline and emphasise that proper policy must not adopt a colourblind, or as Ms. Blackwell quoted from one report, a one-size-fits-all approach. Putting it bluntly, pretending we are all the same means ignoring the needs of diverse communities and of poverty. It means that those who are vulnerable, not only because of clinical needs or disabilities of various sorts, but also through discrimination and economic inequality, will continue to be underserved. Solving structural discrimination is, of course, beyond the terms of reference. However, recognising it and recognising that it must be considered and mitigated in preparedness and planning is not. Professor Nasru, in one of his reports for this module, also comments that beyond recognition of structural discrimination, combating institutional discrimination is easier, at least in concept, because it relates to existing bodies with human and institutional structures through which such discrimination can be directly challenged. Counsel to the inquiry has already highlighted the lack of data regarding ethnicity at the time of the pandemic. Without data, the institutions were not in a position to recognise their own institutional failings in this regard, and disparities of outcome and impact followed. This is a simple example of what needs to change. A key theme of family members regarding impact was summed up by Matt Fowler in Module 1. He said, "Those that we lost without dignity." Andrew Langford of Crews notes that COVID bereavement was symptomatically more complex and challenging for the bereaved to deal with in terms of the initial impact and then the ongoing ramifications. The predominant features of information communicated to Crews by bereaved people included anger and guilt relating to the circumstances of death and isolation. The inability to carry out mourning rituals left people bereft. Issue highlighted by almost all of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice members who contributed to the organisational statement provided by Rabinda Sherwood. Catherine Poole describes ongoing guilt at the fact that her father, who had enduring mental health problems and had been on a section when he contracted COVID, was unable to see him for a month prior to his death. Naomi Fulop asserts that it is a source of great pain to her that she was unable to be with her mother when she died. Many have highlighted the lack of communication prior to death, both with their loved ones after admission to hospital and with clinicians. The lived experience evidence of bereaved families is visceral in this regard. Jane Verboska in Module 6 spoke about an open-ended trauma, a wound that won't close, guilt that won't abate, regarding the death of her mother, isolated from her in a care home for 10 months due to visiting restrictions. Linda Dinsdale gave evidence in Module 6 that she was utterly traumatised by the knowledge that her daughter Cheryl had died alone and frightened in a nursing home. Lynn Golding lost her husband, Charles, with whom she had not spoken since his admission. She describes being stuck in the grieving process due to the lack of information and insight she was given into her husband's death and the lack of control she had over the events as they happened. Rabinda Sherwood herself will give evidence of the inadequate care both of her parents received in the period leading up to their deaths, just 10 days apart. She relates pressure to sign DNA CPRs, use of the matrix that was referred to yesterday, inadequate information supplied to the family, and a consequent belief that each of her parents died alone and scared. Rabinda comments that many bereaved family members who contributed to the organisational statement said that they had residual feelings of guilt and were left wondering whether they could have done more, but the reality was that poor information flows and visiting restrictions had prevented that. The huge challenges of the emergency obviously stretched the limits of what was achievable by hard-pressed services and staff, but the impact was nevertheless severe. Had problems of isolation and communication been foreseen, as they should have been, then it may well have been possible to deploy measures and resources to mitigate those problems and impacts. The inquiry has already heard a significant amount of evidence regarding DNA CPRs and advanced care. You will no doubt recall Susan Sullivan's case, as set out so powerfully before you by her late father, John. Others too. Glenn Grundle has described his experience of DNA CPR with respect to his mother, Milda, and Catherine Poole only discovered after her father's death that he was subject to such a notice. These are issues which have left lasting upset and trauma. Family members have recalled with distress the shortcomings in the way that they and their loved ones were treated after death, how they were ushered out quickly and with belongings in a plastic bag. Others, including Catherine Poole, have recounted that they were unable to see their loved ones after death. Josephine Hanlon from Glasgow is particularly distressed by the fact that her partner, Ernie, was buried in a body bag. All three of our Covid Bereaved Family for Justice members' statements raise the issue of mourning rituals. Rabinda Sherwood tells of the difficulty of honouring the rituals of the Sikh religion in the face of the restrictions then in place. Her mother was not allowed to be buried with her 5 Ks, Sikh symbols she had worn in life. Isolation and the lost opportunity of bringing people together to celebrate the life of the departed are repeated themes. Rivka Gottlieb relates that her father did not have a fitting send-off in compliance with Jewish mourning rituals that had led to a lack of closure. As already recognised, a common complaint is the lack of consistency and clarity in guidance around funerals, a point which surely should be solved for the future in terms of planning. 40% of those responding to a consultation conducted by the UK Commission on Bereavement who wanted bereavement support did not get it. Claire Farnsworth was one of those who sought support but was unsuccessful. Existing charities were overwhelmed and there was a lack of government provision. Dr. Royston says COVID exacerbated existing deficits which were once again foreseeable. Many families report difficulties experienced in accessing information after death. Glenn Grundle's statement in particular raises these issues. Poor access to hospital and nursing or care home records is a recurring complaint. And furthermore, there is both concern and confusion about post-death investigative processes, with inquests largely ruled out, and an absence of accessible processes has been encountered where families believe that there were serious failures in care. Claire Farnsworth has raised the question, did concerns regarding the coroner's system becoming overwhelmed in the pandemic lead to cases where there were significant concerns, such as hospital-acquired COVID, being overlooked? Rabinda Sherwood and Rivka Gottlieb make the point mentioned by CTI yesterday, that the broader impact of rule-breaking at government level, such as Partygate, has exacerbated hurt and grief, with a widespread belief that there was one rule for them and another for everyone else. This has created a culture of low confidence in government and damaged confidence in institutions and public life in general. This has not only made loss greater, but made the bereaved fear that in future, compliance with public health measures may well be less. We urge the inquiry to make practical and direct recommendations to promote change for the future, given that most of the impacts that will be evidenced in these hearings were foreseeable and are plainly seen now. Given the limitations of time, we'll set out proposed recommendations, if we may, in our closing submissions. We do not minimise the huge challenges a health emergency brings, but failures next time can be averted by action now. Among the failures that this inquiry has heard evidence, the failure to prevent and mitigate the human impacts are clear. So is the mantra, planning and preparedness and proper resourcing is all. Thank you.